Welcome to another in the series, Why Study, of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. With me today I have Dr. Frances Knight, who teaches modern church history, and she's going to attempt to answer the question, why study modern church history? So Frances, why study it?
Well, my first and most simple answer is simply because it's there. It's a brute fact. I mean, the modern church history and the modern church has had an enormous impact on the modern world, obviously in the West and of course in recent centuries more broadly right across the spectrum of the world. So because it's there, as I came onto the university campus on the bus this morning, I passed one cathedral and several churches. And so the physical evidence of modern church history is still very much with us. People sometimes ask me what's meant by modern. How do you understand the concept of modern?
Good question. And
it tends to mean 1800 to the present. So I sometimes say that this is a syllabus that gets a year longer every year, which can seem slightly daunting, I think. But 1800 tends to be the starting point, which is, of course, immediately after the French Revolution, and it's when society is seen as moving into its modern phase. So that's how it's used in church history. Quite different, I suppose, from how it would be used in art or architecture, where one would tend to think of modern and modernism as being 1890 to 1950 or something like that. So I think it's a very legitimate question to ask, is what is modern church history and when does it start?
Tell me, when people study any form of history, they tend to get involved in the debates. What are the key debates in modern church history?
Well, one of the big ones, which is a very ongoing issue, is the question of secularization. And in another of these films, you can hear our colleague Dr. Simon Oliver discussing secularization from the point of view of a theologian. For church historians, it's slightly different, I think. The conversation seems to be framed within the understanding that clearly fewer people in the year 2000 were going to church than they were in 1800 as a proportion of the population. Fewer were churchgoers. But it's not therefore a simple question of simply deciding at what point people became less prone to church-going. There are a whole variety of issues which emerge. What is that? What besides church-going can be taken as a signifier of secularization, and what other sorts of issues can be understood in this way. But that is one of the debates which has been going on for a very long time, I think, and it has got a lot more complex as time's gone on. I think from a very kind of simple position of assuming that society was becoming a whole lot more secular, to a much more complicated position of realising that different societies have become secular and are experiencing secularization at very different rates and very different ways.
Could you give me an example of how societies experience secularization at different rates?
Well, I suppose one issue would be the changing relationships with state churches. In Europe, most, if not all, countries had relations, the churches had relations with the state acknowledged one particular church as its state church. And we've seen the process of disestablishment occur in many, but not of course all, states in the course of Europe over the last 150 years or so.
Apart from secularization, what would a modern church historian study?
A whole variety of issues. I think one particular issue which is proving to be quite controversial at the moment is the fallout, if one can call it that, from the beatification of John Henry Newman, which occurred just a month, in fact, before we're having this conversation.
We're making this film in November 2010, and about a month ago, Pope Benedict was in Britain and beatified a 19th century theologian, John Henry Newman, in Birmingham. Okay, tell us, why is this significant and studying it significant?
Well, it is actually producing quite an interesting row at the moment. The current issue of the Journal of Ecclesiastical History, which is one of the leading journals in our field, contains a very interesting article by Simon Skinner, who is a historian in Oxford, who is really criticising the way in which a whole variety of theologians have commented on Newman. And he's actually defending a book which has been written recently by Frank Turner, and which this particular book has been very harshly reviewed by large numbers of very pro-Newman theologians. And he's really saying that these theologians need to stop masquerading as historians and they need to get off Newman's case. So this is an interesting example of a row which is happening at the present time. We don't normally have rows in the modern period because the area is so large that there's usually enough stuff for us to be exploring without us needing to fall over each other and have rows. But this is an example of a particular moment of tension, it seems to me.
You've touched on something there, and that is that the way a historian looks at something is different to the way a theologian looks at something. Would you like to comment on how you think a historian is different to a theologian?
Well, I am unhappy with the idea of there being too large a division between historians and theologians. I think there is a role for history in departments of theology and religious studies like ours. And I'm unhappy with the notion that historians should only operate within history departments and that they should sort of stand clear of theology. But obviously historians, if they are going to be taken seriously, need to practice the historical discipline in ways which theologians, if they're going to be taken seriously, need to practice the historical discipline in ways which historians will find acceptable.
I once heard it described by someone that you must take your method from history, but you can take your questions from theology. How would you stand with a statement like that?
Well, I suppose it depends what the questions are, but I would certainly be willing to listen to the questions and accept that that might be a method that would be helpful to pursue.
When a theologians tend to almost see history as noise. If they could only get to I've often noticed they're trying to get to a pure question. To an extent, aren't historians just muddying the waters and saying it's all more complex?
No, I don't think so. I think we need to understand that religion never happens in a historical vacuum. Christianity is a profoundly historically rooted religion. Every Christian thinker is thinking in a particular context, and it seems to me you can't understand any Christian thinker or his ideas unless you have a very clear sense of where he's rooted.
So theology never takes place in a historical vacuum?
I don't believe so. I don't believe it should. It may do, but I don't believe it should.
Okay. Right, now tell me, if I am to start studying modern church history, where do I begin?
Well, there is a new series which is coming out from IB Tauris. It's the IB Tauris History of the Christian Church. It's in, I think, 7 volumes. And
I see you've contributed one to the series.
And I have indeed, which is why I'm rather vainly promoting this here.
You won't be the first in this series and you won't be the last.
This is my contribution on the 19th century, but it is a very accessible series which is designed for beginners, and it's designed to give people an entry into the subject, beginning with the early church and concluding with the 20th century.
Frances, it's been great talking to you, and thank you for coming here today.
Thank you.
Theology is many things, and history is many things. And in talking to Frances, I hope you, as a student, have realised that there is a discipline which is both historical and theological, and it's called church history. Thanks, Frances. Thank you.